All right, today we're going to go over the progressivism as it crept into the national spotlight. All right, and of course, it crept into the national spotlight with this guy right here. All right, and again, as you know, following McKinley's assassination in 1901, TR went to the White House. He was 42, and at that time, the youngest president in history. And also, if you can believe it, the most athletic. Again, he was not unusual simply because of his age and vigor, but also because he believed that the president should do much more than just lead executive departments. Remember, if you read, he exemplified what he called the bully pulpit position of the president. So, again, he thinks it's the president's job to set the legislative agenda for Congress as well. And again, that was really, really revolutionary at the time. So, thus, by accident of McKinley's death, the progressive movement suddenly shot into high gear under the dynamic leadership of an activist, reform-minded president. So, additionally, presidents in the 19th century had consistently, as we've studied this year, taken the side of business in its conflicts with labor. Hayes did so and set a precedence in the railroad strike of 1877. Cleveland, initiating the injunction in the Pullman strike of 1894. But Roosevelt, in his first economic crisis as president, demonstrated that he was going to be a little bit different, that he was going to favor neither business nor labor, but insisted on what he called a square deal for both. Okay, so balanced. Remember, square, equal sides. In 1902, there was a first crisis of his presidency, and it involved the anthracite coal miners, in particular right here in the great state of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania pride, boys and girls. And really what happens is there's a lockout. The strikers refuse to work. What they want is, a pay increase, all those different things. And what was going to be imminent is if the strike continued, a lot of Americans panicked and were fearful that without coal, they would freeze to death when the winter came. And, Roosevelt took the unusual step at the time of trying to mediate the labor dispute by calling a union leader and the coal mine owners to the White House. The mine owner's stubborn refusal to compromise really upset the president. He basically, and again I'm paraphrasing, said if he wasn't the president with the coal mine owners, that he would have slugged them, basically. So to ensure the delivery of the coal to the consumers, TR becomes proactive and he threatens to take over the mines with federal troops. And the owners finally agreed to accept findings of a special commission. And think about the progressive movement, the commission system. This commission granted a 10% wage increase and a 9-hour workday to the miners, but didn't grant full union recognition. The voters overwhelmingly approved Roosevelt and his square deal by electing him by a landslide in his actual presidency. Remember, he was finishing McKinley's presidency early on. So in 1904, he gets reelected, whatever. Anyway, Roosevelt further increased his popularity by becoming the first president since the passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890 to actually enforce it. Remember, we said that it was a poorly written law and it didn't have much teeth. The trust that he most wanted to bust was a combination of railroads known as the Northern Securities Company. And if you remember, we learned about this. It was basically headed by the most powerful, richest man in America at the time, J.P. Morgan. And so reversing its position in earlier cases, the Supreme Court in 1904 upheld Roosevelt's action in breaking up the railroad monopoly. This cartoon shows Theodore wrestling with the railroads and Uncle Sam watching them. TR shows basically how he handled a lot of the antitrust acts, including the antitrust suit against Northern Securities Company. He wasn't afraid to go after them. So this really upset a lot of big companies, but TR had won. TR was fond of wrestling and manly sports, such as this one. So it also shows the audacity of TR to handle problems with his newly basically proclaimed powers of the presidency. Roosevelt later directed his attorney general to take antitrust action against Standard Oil, going after J.P. Morgan. Now you're going after the big man himself, the chairman of the board, J.D. Rockefeller, and more than 40 other large corporations. Roosevelt did, however, you need to know this, make a distinction between something called breaking up bad trusts. The bad trusts are the trusts that he felt that harmed the public and stifled competition, but he also felt there were good trusts, and he thought they needed regulated, but there were actually good trusts, which through efficiency had poured goods into the economy at low prices, which helped consumers. So good trust, bad trust. Need to make sure you, if you don't know that, go back and read it or find some other material on it. But President Roosevelt also took the initiative in persuading the Republican majority that he enjoyed in Congress to pass two laws that significantly strengthened the regulatory powers of the ICC, or the Interstate Commerce Commission. And we need to know these. Under the Elkins Act in 1903, the ICC had greater authority to stop railroads from granting rebates to favored customers. And then under the Hepburn Act in 1906, 3 years later, the Commission could fix just and reasonable rates. So they could actually control and set prices and rates for the railroads. So in this case, it's saying that Congress does have control over some of these companies, which is progressive, right? You could actually argue that that's downright socialist, but this is where it started. We learned a little bit earlier in the week about The Jungle, which was that muckraking book by Upton Sinclair, describing in horrific detail the conditions of the Chicago stockyards and the meatpacking industry. The public outcry after the impact of the Jungle caused Congress to enact two regulatory laws in 1906. The Pure Food and Drug Act forbade the manufacture, sale, and transportation of adulterated or mislabeled foods and drugs, and the Meat Inspection Act provided that federal inspectors visit meat packing plants to ensure that they met the minimum standards of sanitation. I just put this on here. This is something, I think this was from the 1880s, but cocaine. Cocaine to stop your toothaches. Instantaneous cure. How about that? So, just people going ahead and basically being drug dealers back then, selling any old potion. That's when the government actually started to go in and regulate those things. I don't know if you know this either, but Coca-Cola, in its initial stages, its initial recipe, yep, you guessed it, had cocaine. So anyway, as a lover of the wilderness and outdoor life, Roosevelt made an enthusiastic champion of the cause of conservation. His most original and lasting contribution in this affair or domestic policy may have been his efforts to protect the nation's natural resources. During TR's presidency, he made repeated use of the Forest Reserve Act of 1891 to set aside over 150 million acres of federal land as a national reserve that could not be sold to private interests. In 1902, Roosevelt won passage of something called the Newlands Reclamation Act, which was a law providing money from the sale of public land for irrigation projects in the western states, so making them more farmable. And then in 1908, the president publicized the need for conservation by hosting a White House conference on conservation. Following this conference, a National Conservation Commission was established under Gifford Pinchot of Pennsylvania, whom Roosevelt had earlier appointed to be the first director of the U.S. National Forests. So the good-natured William Howard Taft served as Roosevelt's cabinet member and as of Secretary of War, in the capacity of Secretary of War. And honoring the two-term tradition, Roosevelt refused to seek re-election and picked Taft to be his, Taft, his old friend, to be his successor. It's a decision that Roosevelt would later really regret. But the Republican Party readily endorsed Taft as the nominee for president in 1908, and as expected, defeated for a third time, you guessed it, Democratic candidate William Jennings Bryan. Here's a good cartoon you might need to recall a little bit later. It says the policies, handing over the policies, the baby, there's the big stick going out. Stay tuned. If you watch the video on foreign policy, you know that Taft's going to have a little bit different foreign policy. And actually, Taft had a few different views on a lot of things, actually. Initially, Taft continued Roosevelt's progressive policies. As a trust buster, Taft ordered the prosecution of almost twice the number of antitrust cases as TR. Among these cases was one against U.S. Steel, which included a merger approved then by President Theodore Roosevelt. This really angered Roosevelt. He wanted Taft to do exactly what he had left in place. So the fact that he was kind of doing things on his own, TR, as only TR could, viewed it as an attack, a personal attack on TR's integrity. As a conservationist, Taft established the Bureau of Mines, added large tracts in the Appalachians to the National Forest Reserves, and set aside federal oil lands. He was the first president to do such things. Also under Taft, you have the Mann-Elkins Act of 1910, which gave the Interstate Commerce Commission the power to suspend new railroad rates and oversee telephone, telegraph, and cable companies. So, again, giving more and more power to this Interstate Commerce Commission. That happened under Roosevelt, but it also happened in more extreme measures under Taft. Also, the 16th Amendment is going to be ratified by the states in 1913 and authorized the U.S. government to collect an income tax. This was originally proposed in 1892 by the populace, but it happens under Taft's watch. Progressives heartily approved the new tax increase at first because it applied only to the very wealthy, but that will change. Also, the progressives in the Republican Party were starting to become more and more unimpressed with Taft's achievements. What we're going to start to see is a split in the Republican Party, which is going to lead to the controversial election of 1912. Basically, they became so disenchanted with his leadership that they accused him of really betraying the progressive cause and joining the conservative wing of the party for 4 reasons. They argued that he did so with his Payne-Aldrich tariff, the Pinchot-Ballinger controversy, House Speaker Joe Cannon, and also we'll see the midterm elections. What am I talking about? Well, during his 1908 campaign, Taft promised a lower tariff. Instead, conservative Republicans in Congress passed the Payne-Aldrich tariff in 1909, which raised the tariff on a lot of imports. Taft angered progressives in his party, in the Republican Party, by not only signing the bill, but actually making a public statement saying that it was a good thing in its defense. It actually lowered 650 tariff schedules. It raised 220, and it left 1,150 unchanged. So although the Payne-Aldrich tariff was less aggressively protectionist than the McKinley Tariff Act of 1890 and later the Dingley Act of 1897, it was nevertheless protectionist. So, but think Taft really truly did believe it was a good thing. He thought it was a compromise. He did think it lowered some of the tariffs, but the progressives and the progressive Republicans thought it wasn't good enough, and they thought that he had sold out to big business. So the progressives liked and respected the chief of the Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot, and as a dedicated conservationist. They distrusted Taft's Secretary of the Interior, Richard Ballinger, especially after what he did. He opened public lands in Alaska for private development, and people were like, "That is just off the cuff. Those were set aside, and you're breaking the will of the people here. Anyway, you're a greedy capitalist." 1910, when Pinchot criticized Ballinger openly, as a lot of people were, Taft stood by his cabinet member and fired Pinchot for insubordination. So conservatives applauded this. Progressives protested, obviously. So basically, progressive Republicans become even angrier with the president when he failed to support their effort to reduce the dictatorial powers of Congress' leading conservative Speaker of the House, Joseph Cannon. Insurgency against Speaker of the House Joe Cannon in 1909 and 1910 began. It was basically related to issues of direct democracy. Cannon represented an older view, the old guard view of legislative partisanship, in which the party caucuses kept divisive issues at bay, carefully planning what the record of the party would present to the voters. Basically, kind of, again, dictatorial powers. Now, this cartoon was scanned from the Judge September 17th of 1910, suggests nothing would satisfy the insurgents. They want Joe Cannon, and it demonstrates the idea of expanding popular rule that goes back and will be implemented in 1912 related to these issues. Stay tuned. I'm running out of time. I have a few slides left, so I'm going to have to make another CCast. I know you'll enjoy. Thanks.